Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar book review. This one's going to be for Avatar The Last Airbender, The Shadow of Kyoshi, and it's going to be my non-spoiler review for the book. So I'll have a spoiler review probably tomorrow, and then I'll be starting my chapter analysis videos for the book pretty shortly after that, so that when the book is actually officially released on the 21st, there'll be a good amount of content for you guys to all take in by the time it's fully out. Obviously I got my copy a little bit early. I have been able to read it through fully, and here are my initial impressions. First thing to say is just that I once again, like the first book, super enjoyed this. This has been the best Avatar content this year by a long way, and that's the way I felt about the Rise of Kyoshi last year. I think the books have very quickly shot up to being some of the best pieces of Avatar content we've ever got. It's for sure I think it's the medium that will be able to give us the most depth if they continue to do more novels going forward. They definitely, to me, have gone past the comics in their ability to just do more with its page count and just tell deeper stories. Tonally, I think that was a big thing with the first book that everyone talked about. Tonally, they're able to be that little bit more mature without going like overboard and losing sight of what makes Avatar Avatar. But, you know, in a way, like dark enough to where, like, yes, you can really get across, like, really making villains just with their, you know, approach to bending or something like that. That was why Jianzhu was so good in the first book, of like the way he killed people, and they continue that here with when bending fights happen, people get injured. And especially with how the first book ended with stuff like the surprise and like almost out of nowhere deaths of characters like Lek, the poisoning suddenly of Heiron, Rangi's mother, and so on. Putting key characters in risk, killing off characters you think are safe, main characters. They're willing to do that again here, so there's twists and turns along the way throughout this that are fantastic. In addition to the world building and detail from the first book, which was the thing I, fell in love with the first book, that's here completely once again. But instead of being about Earth Kingdom and sort of Dao Fei, this time it's more about the Fire Nation and its politics, in terms of like we get great detail about the clans, the noble houses basically of the Fire Nation, and the details on them. Like why are these houses noble? How does it relate to the history of the Fire Nation? Of previously it was Fire Islands, each ruled by a warlord, and as we know, the first Fire Lord was the one to unite them all together. So now that they're united, how does that actually look? What are the stuff from history that still remains to this day, bringing that many people together who were previously the rulers of their own lands, but now there's a Fire Lord's singular? How does that all work? That is done fantastically here. And what I think was especially well done about that here is that there was actually some more complicated details surrounding that, because he goes quite in depth on stuff like the fire sages, in addition to like the idea of the fire islands, and like toes is brought up. And I think he navigates, attaching his new stuff to what we already knew before very well. So like no continuity errors from what I could see, while adding great new detail. So world building detail wise, fantastic. And then of course it's a sequel, so it has to cover the plot threads from the first book, and I think it does that well also. The main one of course just being Yoon, who basically, as you go through the book, he is the main plot. As much as I can talk about this book and explain to you about how, most of the book takes place in the Fire Nation, it deals quite heavily with the Fire Lord, Zoryu of this era. Yes, that plot is important and is there for most of the book. But the main plot, you would have to say, is pretty much just the character dynamic between sort of Kyoshi and Yoon. Just the figuring out Yoon, what he's up to, how are we going to resolve this in any way? How has Yoon been affected by Father Glowworm or not? That to me is the main plot of the book. The Fire Nation politics is more of like the setting through which Yoon and Kyoshi and Rangi kind of come back together and encounter each other again. And the plot works on its own, but the thing I think you're truly invested in is definitely why Yoon is this way and how are they going to deal with that. How does Kyoshi feel about Yoon given the way her encounter with Janzu went? That Yoon came in, killed Janzu, but then didn't show a lot of concern for potentially killing a lot of other people, and even her. So how does he feel about that? How does he feel about the fact that basically the reason he's not the Avatar is because Kyoshi is the Avatar? That was the thing that sort of broke him when it happened. That's clearly part of it. There was the big betrayal towards Janzu, but how does he feel about sort of everything else? And that's what is so good throughout this book, is that they devote time to Yoon, I think, very well. And when he's on screen or on the pages, his character, I think, really comes out quite well. There's a prologue chapter at the start that gives you the initial bit of backstory about, like, okay, this is how he survived being kind of taken away by Father Glowworm. And then there's a couple of interlude chapters as you go through the book that also further give that sort of backstory explanation. So when you first encounter Yoon in sort of the present day story of the Shadow of Kyoshi, you're like, okay, this is the character that we met in the scene with Janzu at the end of the first book. But how does he go from here at the start of the first book to being where he is now? And it's not just as simple as just one prologue chapter. It takes those 4 or 5 prologue and interlude chapters to get that across, of his dealings with Father Glowworm, why he decides to get involved in this, or what drives him. And I think that all works very well. While, of course, the plot for Kyoshi is, of course, one, still dealing with the aftermath of the whole Dao Fei stuff. That's where the book starts. Then you have her have to deal with the more political affairs of, she's going to the Fire Nation, she's going to have to talk a lot with the Fire Lord and a lot of nobles from the Fire Nation. So her being Dao Fei is the complete worst character to do all that stuff. So there's a lot of great moments of, people giving Kyoshi all these warnings about, oh no, when you're in this situation, basically we're going into the big banquet, your ultimate goal is to talk to the Fire Lord, but before you can do that, you have to start on this end of the room, he'll start on that end of the room, and you'll mingle your way through the crowd towards each other. And Kyoshi's just like, okay, go talk to the Fire Lord. And they're like, no. You can't just go straight towards him. That will show disrespect to other people. So you have to, talk to some people along the way. And she's just kind of just like, okay, I'll talk to some people. But you have to, and then they always add in another thing of like, no, but you have to talk to the right people. And then because you're the Avatar, you should not initiate contact with people who are of a certain sort of nobility rank, below you or whatever. So she basically just has to walk slowly enough towards the Fire Lord that a few people talk to her, and then she finally talks to him. And then, of course, she seemingly does it all right, and then makes a really bad blunder right at the end. So that's the fun of the sort of Kyoshi and politics thing, of just, the book really is about getting across the idea that she tries, but it's not her thing. She'll be able to do it to a certain point, but it's not really who Kyoshi is, and she ultimately does feel more comfortable just being very blunt with her statements, and it's great to see some of them where she does just come out and like speak very openly to characters and very commanding. And sometimes the characters around her criticize her for it, sometimes they praise her for like, no, that was actually a good time to do it. And so a lot of the character stuff I think works very well. Of course, like I suspected, a lot of the Flying Opera Company members aren't really in the book. Like, there's really only like a scene with Kirima, Wong, Lao Ge. But Rangi, of course, we get to meet her once again. relatively early in this book, we obviously got one of the preview chapters was the reunion with Rangi chapter, and again, like fans of that relationship are, I think, are really going to like what they do with it here. Um, they maintain them, in a relationship. They have individual scenes with them getting a chance to talk. There's a little bit of conflict between the two of them because, of course, Kyoshi has changed a little bit, in terms of the amount of fighting and battling against the Dao Fei she's been doing since then. Rangi has changed a little bit just with the fact that she's been up in the north, helping her mother to heal from the poisoning, and then you see them slowly begin to sort of almost like get used to being around each other more, and their dynamic comes out again. References to the first book and a lot of the more romance focused scenes, but also like the Fire Nation is a bit more, stuffy about, like, we can't really show any of our sort of affections towards each other in public, and there's some fun scenes like with that throughout. But like I said, the main thing really here is that it's about our three sort of teen characters. It's about Kyoshi, Rangi, and Yoon. How do the other characters feel about Yoon now that he's back? How does Rangi feel about Yoon? How does Kyoshi feel about him? How does Heiran feel about Yoon, given that she considers herself part of what Jianzhu did to him in betraying him? And, does he want to go after her or not? There's lots of great moments like that I think work really, really well. The other thing would be some of the newer characters. Monk Jinpa ends up being around for like most of the book. In terms of like the new team that we have in this book, it pretty much is Kyoshi, Rangi. Heiran is in like a good amount of the book, like with Kyoshi and Rangi in scenes with her. Heiran's healer from one of the water tribes is also like a reasonably like a character who's in the book for a lot of it. She's quite fun. She's this kind of like crazy arrogant healer who is clearly the best healer in the entire world, but she lets everyone know about it. It's a fun dynamic because she's actually friends with Heiran, so their dynamic is quite good. And then Monk Jinpa is, of course, with them as well as sort of Kyoshi's, advisor, but he ends up sort of being the sort of like that servant style character to almost like everyone, which is quite fun. Like Rangi, after a few scenes, is pretty much willing to just be like, Jinpa, can you do this? And the same with Heiran. So he's quite good as well. As we go through the book. I think that there's a few little things I was disappointed with in terms of like the more detail focused stuff. When some of the preview material said that we'd get like, say, Rangi backstory, we do and we don't. It's one of those things where they expand a little bit on the little bit of backstory they presented about Rangi in the first book. Would I exactly phrase it as like this book features more Rangi backstory? Not quite, really. Like you find out like one or two facts about her past. Like we don't actually get like backstory sequences with Rangi. She just mentions some stuff about her past growing up and so on. That's really it. It's not as in depth as you'd maybe think. In terms of like we actually do get proper Karuk backstory that is like kind of his point of view, Kyoshi seeing a vision of him, covering him when he was younger, covering him towards the end of his life. They go in depth on that, and that works so well. It's my favorite parts of the book because it just delivers super important content, and finally we have the sort of stuff that is like, to everyone saying that Karuk was like a bad avatar, didn't do anything. And this is Kyoshi's opinion on Karuk for most of the book. Like we saw that this is how she felt about him in the first book. And for the most of the first half of this book, she feels the exact same way about Karuk. That why should she have to get advice from the avatar before her when he was useless, basically? But no. The backstory is so good that it gives like such insight into everything going on and really helps to, I think, bring a lot of the Karuk information together really, really nicely. But again, one of the minor details, continuing on that trend, I wasn't the the biggest fan of like like Rangi backstory, and then it's only a handful of details. Similarly, we learn Kyoshi's animal guide. Kind of like, if that was not stated in that sort of marketing material that we would learn Kyoshi's animal guide in this book, I would not have viewed the only scene in the book that can in any way be interpreted as that as being that's her animal guide. It is so low key of a scene in terms of like, it's just Kyoshi and like an animal, and they directly even in the book kind of like say stuff like that. It's is it a spirit? So like it's not even an animal as such in terms of the way we'd expect an animal guide to be. So I'm kind of like, did I miss something here, or like it's not clear at all in that they never confirm that like Kyoshi's going to stick around with this animal. It is literally just like a sequence where an animal like guides Kyoshi to a place where she can talk to one of the past avatars, and it's like that's it. Like it's like a page and a bit, and there's not really a lot of depth brought up about the animal itself. It is not particularly exciting, given that people actually were excited for what Kyoshi's animal guide would be. I was like, kind of like, wow, like they really overdid that sort of like, we find out her animal guide. We kind of don't, I'd almost say. In that, maybe in a third book, if there was one, and we saw Kyoshi with this animal, that would confirm it. But this scene as it is here just feels like that's a stretch. That feels like a stretch, even though he said that it's in the book. It doesn't really feel like it's here. So I think that's like the majority of the stuff that I want to talk about here, because again, it's so tricky to talk about this without going into many of the details. I think the final thing I'll talk about is just my thoughts on how it ends. Not the details of the ending, but more about, I talked in some of my preview content for this book about how I was worried that the book would, in my mind, I think the best way I said this, explaining this, is that I was worried that this book would just have an arbitrary ending point. That it would literally just end and that's it. And that there'd be no sense that it feels like a conclusion to a series of books. And I think unfortunately they did that. They ended the Shadow of Kyoshi in a way that, to me, the ending in terms of the tone and stuff like that it hits, it actually feels quite similar to the way the Rise of Kyoshi did its ending, where there's absolutely room to do a third book to expand on stuff if they wanted to. But it doesn't feel like a conclusion. And given that we know there's only 2 books, unless they're going to surprise us by announcing something else, they made it fairly clear early on that there are only 2 books in this series. The ending here really doesn't feel like a conclusion to either like this era of Kyoshi's life. It really feels like there could be a direct sequel to this book if there wanted to be, and I don't get really why they do it in this way at all. In that, a lot of people I think are going to be, I think, critical of this book for not covering anything from like after, anything beyond Kyoshi at 17, and I'm a little bit disappointed about that. My issue at the ending is in a way that it is just like an ending of the plot of this book, and not necessarily like the full origin story of the Avatar. And that I almost feel about it like you could have ended with just one book if you had resolved Yoon in some way with like an extra couple of pages, a couple of chapters. But the fact that you've went to do like a whole secondary story, and then you also resolve the Yoon stuff in it feels like it feels like they whatever planning that they did for like the scope of the stories that they wanted to cover here, like it was just like it was a bit longer than one book, and they're like, do we do it as one big book or do we do it as 2? And so they ended up doing it as 2, and you can sort of see from here, Shadow of Kyoshi is much shorter than Rise of Kyoshi. It's 100 pages, pretty much exactly. Rise of Kyoshi is 430 something pages. Shadow of Kyoshi is 330 something pages, and it shows. Just reading the book, you can tell that it is a much shorter book. Like you hit the 2/3 point way through the story, and then the last third of the Shadow of Kyoshi is just like it accelerates so quickly towards the end, that like it really just jumps, like you're like, whoa, wait, we were in the Fire Nation a minute ago, now we're here. Can we slow down for a second so I can get my bearings? Almost was kind of how fast it was done. I appreciate a book that has like a brisk pace, but I feel like they really rushed is the word that sort of comes to mind in parts. I still think like the final confrontation between like Yu and Kyoshi is done very well, but it's more of like the scenes to set us up to get there, and then especially in my mind, just the lack of any real proper epilogue. Like there is a chapter, it is actually called epilogue, I believe. Yeah, it is called an epilogue, but I don't think it works that well in my mind. It would work fine if there was a third book, I think, but to me, the epilogue for the last book in this series, for me, should have been something that has more connective tissue into the other Kyoshi content that we have. Whether that be you actually doing a little bit of a montage through her life quite quickly and covering some of those events, or for me, I would actually just maybe want just a cut ahead to like a 200-year-old Kyoshi, and just a sense for, we knew from the first book how she accomplishes living that long, but we don't really get the why. Why does she choose to live for basically 130 or so extra years? And I would have loved to have gotten just some sort of a scene with a much older Kyoshi just going over like, I've chosen to live all this extra time because this is happening in the world, that to make amends or something like that for Karuk living such a short life, I will live an exceptionally long life to bring peace or something like that. Because as it is right now, it feels weird that, okay, yes, it means that these books are focused. They're very focused because they only cover I suppose flashbacks to a very young Kyoshi and then Kyoshi at 17. But then the rest of Kyoshi's life is like 3 incidents that happen when she's like in or around 40 or something like that. And then at some point, like, she has a daughter called Coco, who that fact is like the most like the one that I think just has the least amount of information about it now. That's the most like, wait, explain Coco based on everything that we know right now. It just I don't get it, because like Rangi isn't in any of the 3 events from Kyoshi's life: the Chin the Conqueror incident, the Peasant Uprising incident, and formation of the Kyoshi Warriors. Those stories, like, you don't see Rangi in them, and you also don't get a sense that Kyoshi has a child at that point. So it's just like, I guess a character who lives like 190 years after those moments, it doesn't matter. But because it's such a crazy number, and because we now know detail-wise like how she can live that long, it just feels weird to not actually cover any of it. And I get it, like the writers and probably people a little bit more defensive about this point will probably be like, oh, but it's kind of already explored, because Lao Ge himself just existing as someone who's maybe thousands of years old maybe explains what Kyoshi would be like when she's much older. But the fact remains is that I don't get why there actually wasn't more scenes with Lao Ge in this book to maybe help to explain some of that stuff. So that's the thing for me, is just like, when I got to the ending and I finished the book, I was a little bit disappointed that it just ends there. That there's no third book planned. It didn't show us Kyoshi at an older point and have these books connect to the other Kyoshi content. or anything like that. And it just felt like, wow, these are two of the best pieces of Avatar content that we have out there. And they just didn't quite get the ending right. And endings are tough to do. Endings are very, very tough to do. But in this case, you can sort of see where the problem is. Of like, this book's 100 pages less than this book. This book with 100 extra pages, I think, could do wonders. And especially because it's such a large amount. Like, it's like 25% less than the first book. It feels like, what happened there? Because like I'll readily admit that like the Fire Nation plot that actually happens in this book, like there's detail to it because they have to explain to you a lot about Fire Nation politics, but the actual, like, I suppose, summation of what actually happens is relatively like simple and to the point. In that, like I said, Yoon as a character is more of the plot of the book rather than the specifics about the politics. But still, so they're my initial kind of thoughts on the book. Another fantastic novel, and I think just through these two books, it's proven. Novel is a format that works for Avatar. They need to do more. I hope they have some sort of plan already in motion for what's next. I hope it isn't just these two novels and they don't have any plans. And I hope they have an announcement probably sooner rather than later. I'd like to straight away know what's coming next. I wouldn't mind if they just announced another Kyoshi novel, honestly. I know some people will be like, move on to something else, but if they wanted to do another Kyoshi novel, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I think the speculation that like it should be a Yang Chen novel, I don't really agree with that, just because I think they would want to do something very different and not just have it be another Avatar that is, especially because like these two books covered so much of the sort of the gist of what happened during Karuk's era and Yang Chen's era. I don't think they'd want to do a book that directly covers that. So I think they would either want to do, like, choose another character from the franchise who could use a book explaining them more and cover them, or potentially do something like Iroh backstory, Red Lotus backstory for like Zahir, Pali, Ghazan, Minghua. That would be very good. That way you kind of have 4 stories in one, or 5, depending if you want to bring like Zybev into that and explore the actual Red Lotus, White Lotus dynamic. That would work, I think, very clearly for a book. That way you can go in depth into sort of politics, the values of both groups, and be very detailed about it. And potentially, if they are very tragic backstories for those characters, you can have very bad stuff happen in a novel like this. But yeah, the basic thing I'd say about it is that if you like the first book, you're going to like the second book. The Kyoshi Rangi scenes, if you're a fan of their ship, you will like them in this book. If you like the way they did the extra bit of violence and detail to the bending fights, it's back here once again. There's some creative kind of new bending techniques. Maybe not as crazy as the first book, but some new stuff in here as well. And the detail is all here. It hits all those points that I made about the first book, but in kind of a slightly different way, a more Fire Nation focused book, but also, another great just group of characters, getting to meet some of the new ones and so on. So that's I feel all I can say without going into any more detail. Like I said, non-spoiler review will probably be tomorrow, followed by some chapter analysis videos to get us started. So that's going to be very fun, because I always get more from the book as I go through it, chapter by chapter. Because especially for this one, where like I wanted to get the review out as soon as possible, I read it in detail. I didn't like speed read through it, but you get so much more by just focusing on these like 8 pages that make up this chapter. We'll get every detail out of it in those videos, so I'm super excited to starting them. But in the comments, let me know if you have any questions about the book or anything like that. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.